Thank you, ladies. So good morning. Welcome to welcome to the third week of Advent. And so the past couple of weeks, we have been talking about packing light. So Pastor's been doing a great job talking about that. I've really enjoyed that. Kind of gives you something to focus on. A little bit of reflection. I always like that, being able to reflect on things. So as a coach, I always like to do that. You have a game, and you get the opportunity after the game to kind of reflect on what went well, what didn't go well. And the same thing is happening with this series that Pastor's been bringing and packing light. You kind of get a chance to look at yourself and the way maybe you've handled yourself recently or throughout your life, and you get to really reflect on things that, hey, maybe I can let this go. I don't have to really carry this around anymore. So this has been a great opportunity to kind of do a little bit of self-reflection in the holiday season to decide what needs to maybe be let go of, and how to bring in some of the better things that God has on offer for us. So we're going to talk about joy, and I think the first thing to do is to separate joy and happiness. A lot of times we kind of equate them to be the same thing, and they're not really the same thing. So happiness depends on happenings, right? Happiness depends on things that are external, things that are going on around us. I'm happy because I found a $20 bill on the ground. I'm happy because my teacher didn't show up today and we had a test and I don't have to take a test, right? That's happiness. It's an external happening. So happiness actually comes from the root word hap, which means luck or circumstance. So it's all about having luck. Now the opposite is joy. Joy is different. It goes deeper. It's an attitude. It's a choice. So you can choose to have joy. Right? That's something that you bring up in yourself. Joy is an inside job. It's not dependent on any of our circumstances. Things can be going crazy around us, but I can choose to have joy. I don't have to have somebody else do something to make me feel joy. I can choose to have that joy. It's our choice. It's no one else's choice if we have joy or not. Joy is what makes life enjoyable, right? And Paul, throughout his books in the New Testament, he lays the foundation for why we as believers have joy and hope that's permanent. So in Galatians, Paul lists the fruit of the Spirit. One of those is joy, right? In Philippians 4:4, he reminds us, rejoice in the Lord always. I'll say it again, rejoice, right? So Paul really focused in on the aspect of joy. And there's so many more examples of Paul. I didn't want to overload you with all the things that Paul said about joy. But he constantly talks about joy in the New Testament. And a key component to joy is actually hope. The two kind of go together, and we kind of need them both. We understand that our hope comes from Jesus Christ, and because of that, we're able to have joy. It's been said a person can live for 40 days without food. You can make it 3 days without water. You can make it 8 minutes without air, but not 1 minute without hope. So as I was researching for all this, I actually came across a study that was done for Holocaust survivors and prisoners of war in World War II. And they actually said it wasn't food that kept them alive or a little bit of food. It wasn't the little bit of water they had, but it was hope. They said most of them pointed to hope as the reason why they survived through such a terrible situation. Because they lacked food, they lacked water, they lacked basic care, but what they held on to was hope. And that hope was just enough to be able to help them through. And a lot of people have hope in this world. They have hope, right? Everybody around us has hope, but they don't base it on anything solid. They base it on the stock market. They base it on their family. They base it on their good looks. They base it on their bank account. And that's all fine. But all those things are temporary. Those all can be taken away. Those aren't guaranteed. When they disappear, the hope goes with it. By contrast, we have a reason to rejoice because we rejoice in hope. We know what our future is going to look like. We know how we can make it through each situation. So I read a story recently that kind of illustrates this idea of joy and hope and excitement, right? So picture this, we're at a park, maybe in a bigger city. There's a college nearby, and there's this young fella sitting at a bench at this park. And he's sitting there, his Bible's open, and he's loudly proclaiming his praise to God. Hallelujah, hallelujah, God is great, he's yelling as he's sitting there. Doesn't care about anybody passing by. He's just super excited. Shortly after, this man comes, and he had just taken some classes at the university. So he's, feeling good about himself. He's feeling enlightened and really knows the truth, and he's ready to show it to somebody. And so he asks the boy about his source of joy. He says, hey, asked the boy in return with a bright laugh. He said, don't you have any idea what God is able to do as the man walked past? I just read that God opened up the waves of the Red Sea and led the whole nation of Israel right through it. The enlightened man laughed lightly. He sat down next to the boy, and he began to try to open his eyes to the realities of the miracles of the Bible. That can all be easily explained. Modern scholarship has shown that the Red Sea in that area was only 10 inches deep. So it was no problem for the Israelites to wade across, the man said to the boy. The boy was stumped. His eyes wandered from the man back to the Bible that was laying open in his lap. The man, content that he had lightened the poor boy, got up and started to walk away. Figured, hey, I educated that young man. My day's done. I feel good about myself. He'd scarcely made it 2 steps when the boy began to rejoice and praise louder than before. The man turned to ask the reason for his resumed jubilation. Wow, the boy exclaimed. God's greater than I thought. Not only did he lead the whole nation of Israel through the Red Sea, he topped it off by drowning the whole Egyptian army in 10 inches of water. The boy was not deterred by the man's view of God. Instead, the boy was encouraged by the thought of God being so wonderful and amazing that he had the ability to drown the whole Egyptian army in 10 inches of water. The young boy was full of joy. Far too often, we let other people's views and opinions distract us from the joy we have in God. Life can beat us down a little bit, and we don't necessarily lose our joy, but sometimes we just misplace it, or we forget about it. Many people think that if they get rid of all their problems, they'll be happy. But it seems to me like once you get rid of one big problem, you start to notice a lot of smaller problems that you were unaware of because you were focused on the bigger one. Joy is learning to enjoy life in spite of problems. Joy is not the absence of suffering, but the presence of God. That is why Paul says, rejoice in suffering. God is always with us. Now, don't misunderstand the idea of rejoicing in suffering. And Paul is not saying that you should fake it until you make it. Don't put on a plastic smile, pretending everything's okay, denying reality, and acting as if nothing is wrong. Paul's not encouraging you to deny that things are bad in your life right now. But he's also not talking about being a masochist. I don't know if you guys have ever met a Christian like this, but I've seen them, I've heard about them. Some of them have a martyr complex, right? The more that I suffer, the more spiritual I am. The poorer I am, the more closer I am to God. And that's not what Paul's talking about at all. It's completely different than that. Oftentimes we focus on that, like, look at me, I'm suffering. You don't have to do that. Suffering can produce good things in your life, sure. But Paul's not saying that we have to beat ourselves up to be a good Christian. He says we rejoice in our suffering. He's not saying rejoice because of our suffering. He's not saying we enjoy suffering. He is saying we rejoice in it because we know the suffering has a purpose behind it. That's the perspective that Christians have over non-Christians. We understand that there's a purpose to maybe why we're struggling in this moment. We understand that there's something bigger going on, that God has something in store for us, a learning experience. He's gonna just show us, maybe we're doubting if God is even able to do what he can do, right? But he's gonna show us, hey, look, I am who I say I am, and here's why. So that perspective always determines how we can react to the events that are happening around us. So here's an example of perspective, right? I found this little funny letter that a college student wrote. Now, younger kids, you don't know what letters are, right? But these are things that we had to do before these machines called cellular phones, right? We had to actually take a pen and a pencil and this thing right here, it's called paper, right? And you had to write down a letter. So you had to be able to spell. Phone didn't fix it for you. You had to learn how to spell. You had to learn how to write properly and put punctuation, okay? So this is old, obviously, because it's a letter. But this is what she wrote to her parents. And so think about perspective as I read this letter. Dear Mom and Dad, I'm sorry to be so long in writing. Unfortunately, all of my stationery was destroyed the night our dorm was set on fire by the demonstrators. I'm out of the hospital now, and the doctors say my eyesight should return sooner or later. The wonderful boy Bill, who rescued me from the fire, kindly offered to share his little apartment with me until the dorm is rebuilt. He comes from a good family, so you won't be surprised when I tell you we're going to be married. In fact, since you've always wanted a grandchild, you'll be glad to know that you'll be grandparents next month. P.S. Please disregard the above practice in English composition. There was no fire, I haven't been in the hospital, I'm not pregnant, and I don't even have a steady boyfriend. But I did get a D in French and an F in chemistry, and I just wanted to be sure you received this news in the proper perspective. Perspective, purpose, right? So now let's take a look at the story that I'm going to focus on. And this is one of the Christmas stories that sometimes gets lost in all the other ones. But for me, I really like this story. It has a little bit of everything. It has a little bit of suffering and a little bit of joy in it. So if you guys want to open up to Luke chapter 1, 5 through 25, and then I'll have it up on the screen. So I'll give you a minute to get there. This is a long section of reading, so please bear with me. We'll read it all the way through, and then we will kind of break it down a little bit at a time. So, in the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah, who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. Pastor loved that pronunciation. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. But they were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. Once, when Zechariah's division was on duty and he was serving as priest before God, he was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And when that time for the burning of incense came, all the assembled worshipers were praying outside. Then an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. When Zechariah saw him, he was startled and was gripped with fear. But here we go. But the angel said, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John. He will be a joy and delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth. For he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He is to never take wine or fermented drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before he is born. He will bring back many of the people of Israel to the Lord their God. And he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn their hearts of the parents to their children, and to the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, and to make ready a people prepared for the Lord." Zechariah asked the angel, "How can I be sure of this? I'm an old man, and my wife is well along in years." The angel said to him, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to tell you this good. And now you will be silent and not able to speak until the day this happens, because you did not believe my words, which will come true at their appointed time." Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondering why he had stayed so long in the temple. When he came out, he could not speak to them. They realized he had seen a vision in the temple, for he kept making signs to them, but remained unable to speak. When the time of his service was completed, he returned home. So here we have it. It's a lot of things to really look at, so we're going to try to break it down like I said. This is one of my favorite Christmas stories. It oftentimes, like I said, gets forgotten. Obviously, the birth of Jesus is probably my favorite Christmas story. I mean, come on now, how can you pick anything else, right? But this story has a little bit of everything. Has a do not be afraid reference, a promise, some suffering, love. I mean, if you really stop and think about it, it could be a Hallmark movie, right? Made for TV. Picture this, a nice elderly couple, never had any kids, down on their luck, living in a quaint little town. A stranger comes to the town and delivers news. Great news. Joy, excitement, but not without some adversity. The man cannot tell his wife what's about to happen to them, but eventually she pieces it together from all his gestures and mumbles, and they're filled with joy at the coming of their child. Fade to the hospital scene, crying baby boy, overjoyed parents, fade to black, Merry Christmas, dry your eyes, roll credits, right? Beautiful Hallmark movie, there it is, right in the story of Zachariah and Elizabeth. But really, let's take a deeper look at this. First, let's look at the meaning of their names. Now, when I first spoke to you guys, my first sermon was on names, if you remember way back when. It's been a while since I did that. But I looked at the importance of names, especially names in the Bible, and especially names that when you come to Christ, the new one that God gives you. So when we look at their names, Zechariah in Hebrew actually means God remembers or the Lord remembers. While Elizabeth means my God is an oath or the oath of God. Now, like I said, names have meaning. So it's no surprise that the two people whose names mean God remembers in his oath that God is about to use to lay the groundwork for his coming son, right? They're going to pave the way for what's about to come. So in verse 6, the Bible gives a pretty clear picture of who the two of them are when it comes to their spiritual life. So as you can see up on the screen, both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. So we can gather from that they're two pretty good people, righteous in the sight of God. They follow all of his commands without blame, and in that time, many of the priests actually cared more about the way they were received in public or perceived in public than they did about how they were faithful to God in private. They cared more about that outward sign. And a good example of that is just look at the priest in the story of the Good Samaritan. He crossed the road so as not to ruin his reputation. So he cared more about his external the way that he looked externally than the way that he was internally. But Zechariah and Elizabeth cared more about being righteous in the sight of God, not publicly. I have no doubt, based on the description of Zechariah and Elizabeth, that they had prayed endlessly for a child. Right? At this point in their lives, God hadn't given them that answer to prayer. Now, when they say of old age, I came to understand that most biblical scholars are thinking 65 or older. Right? So in our terms now, there's probably no chance, right, that you would be able to conceive at that age. So there was no doubt in their minds that it was likely not going to happen for them too. But still, they prayed, even though it wasn't answered. And we know that because in verse 13 it says, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, your prayer has been heard." They continued to pray. It's been heard. God has heard it. It's an example of never ceasing to pray. At 65, they could have given up hope, right? Why are we continuing to pray about this, Zechariah? I'm old, you're old, there's no point. But they didn't. They continued on, just like Paul talks about in 1 Thessalonians. So here you have a husband and wife, faithful to God, longing for a child but never having one, praying for a child, and then enter Gabriel. I can only imagine at that moment the way Zechariah was filled with joy. Probably some terror as well. You know, we always talk about the angel, and I love this. The angel always comes in, big, scary, and they tell you it's, you know, frightening, and they're filled with terror. And he comes in with the old "do not be afraid" line. Like, come on, man, I'm not buying that. I'm not buying what you're selling. I'm going to be afraid. But hearing from a divine being that his prayer has not gone unheard, but in fact would be answered at that very moment, had to be very exciting for Zechariah. Here it was, something they had longed for coming true. It would have been easy for Zechariah and Elizabeth just to give up. It would have been super easy. I'm sure many of us here have been praying for someone, have been praying for something, and it gets to a point where it's just easy to say, you know what, it hasn't happened, so it's not going to happen, so I'm just going to stop. But if we can take an example from these two, they didn't stop. They continued. Again, we have to look at it as we want things in our time. Just as I'm sure those two thought about it too. They wanted it in their time, and they thought their time had passed, but it hadn't passed in God's time. We have to remain faithful that if we keep praying, if we keep asking, and when God's time is right for us, that's when he'll answer that prayer. God's time is not our time. So he didn't stop praying when things looked hopeless, even when they reached the old age, and neither should we. Keep praying for those people in your family that you're praying for. Keep praying for your kids. Keep praying for your parents. Keep praying for your neighbor. Keep praying for that spouse that you haven't gotten yet. Keep praying. Don't stop. God, our God, and this is important, our God is the God of impossible. I think sometimes we forget that. He's the God of the impossible. If he can take this older couple and give them a child who would pave the way for his son, nothing is impossible. So barrenness, when we look at Zechariah's job, he was a priest. And that probably caused a lot of stress in the relationship, right? Because barrenness at that time was considered something bad. It was an unknown sin that the parents had done, and that's why you couldn't have kids, right? So you were childless because of some secret sin in your life. And so Zechariah would have had the option to divorce Elizabeth. According to Old Testament law, because she didn't give him a child, he could have divorced her. It would have been a clean divorce in the sight of God, and he could have married another woman who would have given him a child. And that's all based on biblical law. And I'm sure Elizabeth would have felt some shame. Her husband's a priest. He's in a position of some power, and she was unable to conceive and give him what he would have wanted, a child, especially a male child. But they didn't do that. Elizabeth didn't quit on it. Zechariah didn't quit on it. They remained faithful to each other in the relationship that they had, and more importantly, they remained faithful to God. So it was at the very moment that he heard the good news that Zechariah did something that almost all of us do. The faithful man that he was, he faltered. And this is what he did. He blurted out in verse 18. He said, "How can I be sure of this? I'm an old man, and my wife is well along in years." The angel says, "You're going to have a son." And he said, "How can this be?" Right away. There was no pause. He had just experienced something that very few people up to that point had experienced. He had a visit from an angel, and yet he still doubted. You have this divine being standing in front of you, and he still doubted. How can I be sure of this? So Zechariah would have been versed in Old Testament scriptures, right? He would have remembered God's promise to Sarah, also past childbearing years. He would have been able to remember that, and they were given a son. But at that moment, I doubt that he was really thinking back to the Old Testament, right? He probably had a lot going on at that moment, so he wasn't thinking back to that. I personally be more worried about if I was going to make it out alive rather than remembering a history lesson, right? I'm just trying to get out of here. I don't want to die. I'm not thinking back to Old Testament here. But God does what God does. He gave a sign to Zechariah, which usually he did in the Bible. His sign to Zechariah was, you doubted, now you're going to be silent until birth. That's when you'll know that I'm God, right? He said, and now you'll be silent and not able to speak until the day this happens, because you did not believe my words, which will come true at their appointed time. So dare I say it, Zechariah was now filled with joy, unspeakable joy. It's an overflowing well, no tongue can tell, right? Zechariah is now unable to speak, full of joy, excited, doubted, and now he has to be shown, hey, I am God. I told you what I was going to do and you doubted. So now you'll be silent. You won't get to share this news. So I feel like Zechariah probably wasn't too upset by this, right? He had prayed all those years for a son. I bet he'd have no problem taking a little bout of muteness in order to have a child with his wife. So with a show of hands, how many of you wouldn't mind if your spouse was silent for 9 months? Kidding, just don't. Joe, put your hand down. Listen. Don't raise your hands. Don't nudge your neighbors. I'm sure some of you in here would love it if your spouse was silent for 9 months, right? I'm not putting my hand up. I'm just demonstrating, okay? So But here he is, Zechariah. He was just given life-changing news. He would have a child who would pave the way for the Messiah. Man, I couldn't imagine what he felt. Your child that you're going to have, and you're going to have the responsibility of raising, is going to be the paving the way for the Messiah. I mean, unbelievable. His doubt cost him that chance, though, to declare the good news with his voice. But voice or no voice, Zechariah had been shown God's power and his goodness. So now think about the other priests, right? It said in there that there were other people waiting outside for Zechariah. I'm sure there were a few sideways looks and a few mumbles as well. I mean, he had been in there for some time. His job should have been done by now. But he wasn't out yet. So I pictured a conversation was like this. Well, he should have been out by now. How long until we go in after him? Another priest lost because he didn't follow God's commands for the temple ritual. I'm not going to go in after him. It's your turn. So while all this conversation is taking place, and all these people are trying to figure out why has he been in there for so long, here comes Zechariah. Out he walks. Beaming, excited, and quiet. Can't say anything. Making hand gestures, I'm sure, grunts, trying to explain his joy at the news that he had just received. And now he has to go home. Now he has to try to fill his wife in on what had just taken place. And so I really like how all that happened, right? Zechariah, man of God, he's in there by himself. He has this honor of doing this temple ritual, and here comes Gabriel. Here comes an answer to prayer. Here comes doubt, just like you and I. So, we don't have to think that these people that we read about in the Bible that lived these great, awesome lives. They had the same struggles we do. And here's a man of God who had doubt and didn't know if it was possible. And God said, well, it is possible. Here I am. And so another part of the story that really stands out to me happens later on in Luke chapter 1. It's where Elizabeth and Mary kind of come together. And yes, it's the same Mary who's going to be the mother of Jesus, right? So these two are actually cousins. And they both have this joy, and they both have received this great news. So Mary came to visit her cousin, whom she heard was with child, even in her own age. And when Mary walked in, the child inside of Elizabeth's womb leapt. And here's what Elizabeth says in Luke 1:44. She tells Mary, as soon as the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby in my womb leapt for joy. Joy. It's an internal emotion. It comes from inside. I'm sure many of you know the old Sunday school song. I've got the joy, 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 joy down in my cart. No, down in my cart. Joy, 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 joy. No, Pastor Glenn, you didn't like that. All right, Pastor Glenn didn't like that. No, that's the wrong version. That's the wrong version. That's right. Wrong version, Pastor Glenn. I'm sorry. It's I've got the joy, 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 joy down in my heart. Down in my heart to stay, right? It's inside. It's not dependent on external happenings. So anyways, the joy of what was occurring to both women in that little sequence in Luke 1:44, it was shared between the two of them. Mary was excited for her cousin Elizabeth, who was old, and Elizabeth was excited for young Mary. They shared in it together. It would have been really easy for both women to be jealous of the other one. You know what I mean? Well, we're both having kids at the same time. Are you going to name them the same thing I am? I've seen this happen at work or in families. I've talked to someone I work with. His in-laws got pregnant at the same time they did, and it was a show of who had the better pregnancy and the gifts and all this stuff. And it would have been so easy for those two women to do the same thing. But instead, they celebrated together at the favor they were both shown. They took time to share in each other's joy. And it's okay to share in someone's joy, even if we aren't joyful in that moment. It's okay to take time to celebrate with somebody else, even though maybe we're going through a little bit of a struggle right now. So back to our story. The time comes for Elizabeth to finally give birth, right? The big day is here. She's excited. The parents are excited. They finally get to see the child of promise. Zechariah will finally get to speak, which I'm sure he's really excited to do. Elizabeth, probably not so excited about that part. But as the custom happens, after the baby is born, 8 days later, everybody kind of gets together. The child isn't named right away like we do. And their custom back in the Old Testament and in biblical times, the baby was named on the 8th day when they performed the circumcision. And it was a big to-do. Everybody showed up. The neighbors would have been there. The relatives would have been there. Everybody would have been really excited. And almost all of them would have been 100% sure baby would be named Zechariah, named right after his father. They were so certain, and if you guys go and read this in Luke 1, I didn't want to overload you with scripture, but if you go on, the family actually gets really pushy about it. They keep saying, you don't have anyone in your family with that name. You don't have anybody with that name. You can't name him John, right? Elizabeth tells them, I'm going to name him John. And the family is like, Elizabeth, shh, you don't have anybody with that name. We'll name him something else for you because you're not capable, right? And so, as I'm sure at this point, Zechariah is sweating bullets, right? He's panicked. These people that I invited are going to name him something else, and I'm never going to speak again because I can't speak until he is named John. So here he is. Zechariah finally says, give me a pencil. Give me something to write down. I'm going to tell these people that she's right, and they need to listen, and they're naming the kid John. So he motions for a tablet, and he brings it over so that he can write down John, just as Elizabeth had said. And so he did. As soon as he wrote down the following, his name is John, Zechariah was able to speak. Promise fulfilled, right? God said, you won't speak until the child is born. And when he named the child, he was able to speak. But notice what he did not write down. He didn't write down, it might be John, possibly John, could be John. I imagine he wrote it really emphatically, right? Breaking the writing utensil because he didn't want to be mute forever, and he wanted to fulfill what God asked him to do. And he wrote down John, right? His name is John. There's no doubt about it. John is going to be his name. No questions, no mistaking what it would be. And God answered their prayers, filling them with joy. And in return, they did as the angel instructed, and they named him John. So John, the name that Gabriel told Zechariah that was to be his name. Want to know what that name means? John means the Lord is gracious. Power in names. There are power in names. And how gracious was he by answering their prayers and delivering them a son? Zechariah and Elizabeth followed God's laws and commands. They were found righteous and blameless in his eyes. They also followed his plan for the child that he gave them. And by following God's plan, they had joy. There are so many chances for the couple to do their own thing and go against God's plan. But they didn't. They clung tightly to his promise of a child and the fact that once the child was named, Zechariah would find his voice again. This is the same thing that can apply to our lives. Following God's plan that he laid out for us can bring us joy. But the inverse is also true. Doing the things that we want to do and how we want to do them can bring us the opposite of joy. And so I found this quote. It's from a pastor from a church in Portland, Oregon, which sums up what joy can be in our lives. Joy is an act of defiance against the three enemies of our soul: the world, the flesh, and the devil. It's an act of defiance. Making a stand against the things that try to break us. Joy is what holds the darkness away. Joy is what gets us through the valleys. Joy is what carries us when we don't think we can continue. What brings you joy? What has God done over your lifetime that you can recall in those tough times that could bring joy in those battles? So I'm going to have the worship team come up again, if you guys could. We're going to sing Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee again. And as they come, I want you to think about times in your life when your heart was full of joy. Think about those times when you were really full of joy, the birth of a child, the day that you knelt at an altar and received Christ as your Savior, a time when you had a bad diagnosis, prayed, you got a different answer at the end of it. any of those things. Think about a time when your heart was full of joy and reflect on God and His goodness to you. If you guys want to stand, you can with the worship team.